Dude, carbs are the best. And we're going to talk about today how they're not just the bad guy, right? So a lot of people talk about carbs as if they're like the end all, like if you avoid carbs, everything will be good. If you don't avoid carbs, you're going to die, right? Everyone talks about them as being like the real bad guy. And so today we're going to talk about how you can use carbs effectively to help you get stronger or faster or improve your endurance or whatever, what have you, I should say. So we're coming at this from kind of a scientific background. This presentation has been repurposed from one that I made a while back, and so I wasn't necessarily making it for the mixer community. I was making it more for my class that I was taking at the time, and so it's pretty sciencey. There's some pretty heavy-duty studies that are in it, and there's some kind of difficult to read charts and graphs and stuff, and I'm going to do my best to walk you guys through it, but the information that's in it is actually pretty straightforward. So it may be difficult to understand what you're looking at, but as I talk you through it, it's going to make a lot of sense. Milo, thank you for that, host, man. Oh, Minnie, I appreciate that, man. Thank you so much. All right, so, and Echo with the host. Yeah, buddy. Thank you, Echo. I appreciate that, man. Daily host. I don't know. So, this says low glycemic index carbs, but we're going to talk about both low and high glycemic index carbs. So, what does that mean? So, let me get over here. Boom. What is the glycemic index? So, we all eat carbs, right? Everyone's got them. Everyone has them in their daily intake. Unless you're part of the keto group, everyone ingests carbs. And the most common and most important of these carbs is glucose. So whether you're eating apples or bread or pizza or sweet potatoes, glucose is really kind of the main carbohydrate. And when I say carbohydrate, that can mean either sugar or starch, but glucose is really like the base of where all this is centered around. So we're going to talk a lot about glucose today, and this is the main simple sugar that you get your energy from. How do you become a host? You can just click the three little dots next to the follow button on the stream interface, and there's a host button right there. All right, so what is glycemic index? So glycemic index refers to what happens to your blood sugar level when you consume a particular amount of a given carbohydrate. So if I ingest a gram of glucose, how does that affect my blood sugar versus a gram of fructose versus a gram of isomaltose versus a gram of these particular foods over here? Let me see. Can I make a laser pointer? Yes, I can. Yoink. All right, so you can see glucose is definitely the standard when it comes to glycemic index. They've set glucose as the 100 point, and what that means is that when you ingest other sugars or carbs, they set glucose at 100, so it's an easy comparison. So sugar, like table sugar, is I think it's sucrose. Compared to glucose is much less. It's about 65% as much as glucose is. And there are other ones that are, higher than glucose, some that are lower than glucose, but this is the glycemic index, how things compare to glucose in how your blood reacts to them, how your blood sugar reacts to them. So things that are high glycemic index, like glucose, if you ingest them, your blood sugar goes up very, very fast, and your insulin levels go up. Interesting that those are just popping up in chat. How weird. Huh. Hey, Toastman, how you doing, my man? And then things that are low glycemic index do not affect your blood sugar as much, meaning maybe they don't digest quite as quickly, or maybe they don't turn into glucose quite as well. But that's what I mean when I say glycemic index. So how does ingesting this particular sugar or starch affect your blood glucose level, your blood sugar level? And so they've taken, this is a nice little chart because they've taken all these like common foods and fruits and vegetables and dairies and proteins, and they've compared them to glucose to show how they affect your blood sugar levels. So things like asparagus and broccoli and celery, since they don't really have a lot of sugar in them, almost at all actually, they have a very low glycemic index, 15. It's just not a lot. Whereas things like, white bread and bagels, those are like 100% straight glucose. They're all just white sugar carbs. They go right in there and they spike your blood glucose big time. Watermelon has that high of a rating? Yep. So anytime you encounter like a really sweet fruit, fruits that have like a really nice sugary feel, so like watermelons. I know oranges aren't quite as high, but things like pineapple, there's a ton of sugar in there. That's the reason. Like they've evolved in such a way that they are tasty to animals. They're nature's candy, as they call them. They have a lot of sugar in there, which is why generally the recommendation of consuming a lot of fruits and vegetables when you're trying to lose weight, you have to be careful with it, because fruits by nature have a lot of sugar and they can actually have a negative effect as well if you go too far. Yeah, pretty much, and that's barring any like artificial sweeteners and stuff like that. What's in the top right corner? Let's see, that's the Stream Boss, and I will talk about him a little bit later. So let's move forward. Boom. So we know what glycemic index is now. Then here's a good visualization of glycemic index. So this is your blood sugar level, and if you eat a high glycemic index carb, you can see how your blood sugar goes up very, very quickly, very high, and then it also plummets down very quickly. Whereas a low glycemic index carb, your blood sugar never really goes up that high, but then it does not drop down nearly as far when it's done. So it actually ends up being higher 2 hours later versus much, much lower within the first half hour, 45 minutes. So this can actually be felt. I don't know if you've experienced this before. You eat a big high carb meal, a bunch of bread or a bunch of candy, and you feel really good for a little while. You feel like you have a bunch of energy because you got all those carbs. And then, a couple hours later, you feel like you're in the toilet, that big old crash. And this is exactly what that means. This is the crash that people talk about, a sugar crash. I don't think anyone's doing that. Mini Coop? No worries. All right, so this is exactly what you're feeling, right? So this is your blood sugar level. It goes up, and you feel great, and then it drops back down. You feel like poop, and hopefully with the low glycemic index carbs, you never really feel that, because you're not going up very high, you're not going down very low. You don't get the rush and then the crash. That's why you eat spaghetti dinner before a big game. Actually, you know what? We're gonna get to that. This right here actually is not why you eat a spaghetti dinner before the game, but we will get to why you do eat a spaghetti dinner before the game in just a little bit. Very, very soon. Don't worry, Minnie, we've got the moderation under control, dude. We will take 100% care of that, I promise you. Sweeten your tea with agave nectar. A friend recommended me because it's apparently non-glycemic, and now I like the taste. Well, that's perfect. So when he says that it's non-glycemic, it means that whatever is in agave that makes it sweet cannot be turned into glucose by your body, which means that it doesn't spike your blood glucose at all. But it does taste sweet on your tongue. So it'd be similar to an artificial sweetener in that your tongue recognizes it as a sugar, so it tastes sweet, but then it doesn't convert into calories, right? Because calories come from glucose or other sugars getting turned into glucose and then glucose getting used for calories. But if it can't be turned into glucose, then it is not a problem. So the theory with low glycemic index carbs, there's a couple of pieces to it. Number one is they're usually more complex. They're usually very starch and very convoluted in their structure, so they take a long time to break down. They usually contain more than just sugar. So a good example with this is brown rice. Brown rice has starches in it that can be turned into sugar, but they also have the husks and the fiber in them. And so it makes it so that digesting what little sugar there is in brown rice makes it a lot more difficult, because there's all this other stuff kind of interfering with your digestion. So your blood glucose doesn't go up with those. So they digest much more slowly, and it allows for much longer term energy versus the really simple sugars. Oop. All right, so when we're talking, I'm going to go back to Pyro's question. When you're getting ready for the big game, or say you've just finished a big game, we want to recover from exertion using carbs. So the goal is what's called glycogen restoration and next day performance. So what is glycogen? So glycogen is this big, beautiful molecule right here, and this is how your body stores its sugar energy. So in every muscle that you have, in every limb and every movement, all your muscles, they store this molecule here called glycogen. The gaming will probably be in a little while, man. I don't know exactly when it'll be, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. But glycogen here, each one of these little dots, you can see every one of these little dots here. Every one of those little dots is a glucose molecule. And so your body stores glucose very efficiently. And so after you're done exercising, if we want to build this glycogen back up, we need to add glucose to the system in order for your body to store it well. So this is how it's stored. So what is the best way to restore this glycogen after you're done exercising? So remember I said that this is going to get a little sciencey here, so bear with me. You don't need to remember any of these names at all, but these are the guys that ran the study, and you're going to see me use this notation a couple of different times today. But let's walk through some of the science that they did, and it's gonna bring to light some really cool, interesting stuff. So what they did, they put subjects through what's called a glycogen depleting protocol. And what that means is they made these guys do exercise to the point where their muscles literally had no fuel left. They burned through all of their glycogen. They had none left. And so they cycle at 90% of their absolute maximum for 2 minutes. So what does that mean? That means if you were to do all-out sprint as fast as you possibly could, that would be 100%. And you can probably do that for maybe 20 or 25 seconds, maybe. And so they only backed it up by 10%. They made these guys cycle 90% max for 2 minutes, which is a really, really long time. And then they let them go to 50%, and then they made them go 80% for 2 minutes, and then 50, and then 70%, and then 60, and then they made them go 60 to failure. And that means just like they literally had nothing left in the tank, they had to stop. And so these guys were just completely gassed. Okay, so that's the state that these subjects are starting in. And then this was the test here. They gave them either 80 grams of just straight glucose, which is what we know gives a really high spike and then drops down, or they gave them 80 grams of fructose. And you can see the glycemic index of glucose is 100, like we talked about, and the glycemic index of fructose, which is a different kind of sugar that can be transferred into glucose, is only 25. So they got, hey, Mr. Medic, thank you for that $5 donation, man. Awesome. Thank you so much, dude. Much appreciated. So, oh man, I'm all excited. Thank you, man. I appreciate that a lot. So we want to look at how their muscle glycogen, when it says vastus lateralis, it's talking about their leg, right? Their quad muscle. We're talking about how their quad muscle glycogen looks after 8 hours of eating either glucose or fructose. Okay? So we got these results here, and you can see that they started off really close together. Everyone started off about the same. Yeah, the stream boss did lose health. So the stream boss gets attacked every time someone follows, every time someone donates, and then at some point when we are able to get subscribers will do that as well. So the stream boss takes, I think it's 10 points of damage for every follower and 100 points of damage for every dollar, and more for subscribers later, but we haven't set that yet. So anyway, that's the stream boss. And again, I'll talk more about that later. Oh, Medic, that was just super nice of you, dude. I appreciate that. Thank you. So here you can see we're comparing muscle glycogen between the cyclists who were given fructose and those who were given glucose. And so here's the answer, right? So if you completely run out of gas and then you cycle in only glucose or only fructose, it looks like, and this makes sense, that glucose is a whole lot better at restoring glycogen than fructose is, right? That makes sense. So if you add glucose to the system, it makes it a whole lot easier for your body to store glucose, right? Makes sense? Don't worry, Echo, we'll get there. We'll talk about that later. We're focusing on this right now, and then we'll move over in a little bit. Now we'll explain it all. Perfect. All right, so that all makes sense, right? That's a pretty straightforward study. Guys who took glucose ended up restoring their glucose better than the guys who took not as much. Makes sense. All right, so again, we're looking at another glycogen recovery study here. These are a different group of guys in a different, what's called protocol, means they did it a different way. Oh, Medic, thank you so much, man. You have a wonderful night, dude. I will talk to you very soon. So, once again, we're going to put these guys through a pretty tough protocol, a 2-hour, what's called steady state. I just wrote SS here, but this is a steady state ride at 75% VO2 max. So what that means is they rode for 2 hours at the same rate at 75% of what would be their maximum output. So after we did that 2-hour ride, then we did 4 30-second sprints. And I don't know if you guys have done 4 back-to-back-to-back, like all-out sprints, but that is a really great way to make someone just like totally wipe out. It's really, really tough. All right, and so again, after we wiped out all their muscle glycogen, then we wanted to see how they replenish over the course of time with different meals. So they were given 4 meals over the course of 24 hours, a total of 10 grams of sugar or 10 grams of stuff per kilogram that they weighed. So if I weigh 220 pounds, I weigh 100 kilograms. So that means that I would get 100 times 10, I would get 1,000 grams of carbs to recover with, which is a lot, over 24 hours. So anyway, that's how they started. And so these are the results here. They were given either low glycemic index carbs or high glycemic index carbs. And here we are again, we can see that the people who took high glycemic index carbs recovered a whole heck of a lot better than those who were given low glycemic index carbs. They had better blood glucose, they had bigger insulin spikes, they had, and these are the same but different time periods. But the big takeaway here is that once again we see people who want to recover quickly from exercise should be taking high glycemic index carbs versus low. So let's turn this into a real world application. So why does this matter? So say you're going to go to a tournament and you have a soccer tournament, we'll say, and I have a game in the morning and I have a game in the afternoon, and then tomorrow I got 3 more games that I got to play. So I want to be as close to my peak performance as possible for every game throughout the course of the weekend. So how can I make that happen? So now we're going to go back to Pyro's comment a little bit earlier. This is why you have that big bowl of spaghetti the night before, or even the day, I shouldn't say the day of, but the night before. We want to get those muscle glycogen stores as high as we possibly can for each one of those competitions, right? And so if I'm trying to recover, so I have my morning game and I want to recover for my afternoon game. If I have my afternoon game and I want to recover for tomorrow's game, the best way for me to get energy back into my muscles is to do it with the simplest sugars possible. Like, I'm talking like straight glucose or very simple spaghetti or white bread or, bagels or whatever it is. We want to get as sugary as we possibly can. We're not worried about, the weight loss at this point. Remember, today is more about performance and how do we make ourselves better at how we, stronger and faster and such. And that's what the point of this one is. And so this is kind of a cool way that we can use carbohydrates to improve how we play on the field or how we work out in the gym. Now, is there a way to take straight glucose? Yes, actually they make a couple of products that are like goo. They're like pudding, but really thick. Usually they're chocolate or vanilla flavored, and they will be 100% straight glucose. Now, are those like significantly better than eating just a bagel? Probably not, but they are really cheap and really convenient. No, I shouldn't say really cheap. They're moderately cheap, and they're really convenient because it's like a Go-Gurt, right? You can just go and be done. And so you can do that, or you can just have a ton of processed white sugar and white starch and be okay. So, I mean, like a bowl of spaghetti will do really, really well. A bagel with cream cheese will do really, really well. Like, there's really a lot of great ways by just eating normal food that will get you right where you need to be. And this study is actually a really good example of that, because we look at what these guys were eating. These low glycemic index carbs guys, or I should say these high glycemic, look at what they were eating. They're eating cornflakes, bread, tomatoes, instant mashed potatoes, skim milk, versus these guys over here were eating oats, a little bit of pasta, but it was some beans. So there were some crossover in foods, but high glycemic versus low. So I mean, it's definitely possible to. I mean, like, look at this, cornflakes right here, glycemic index of 121, kind of redonkulous. So you can do really, really well, and you don't have to go with straight glucose. All right. What do I think of beta-alanine? I will talk about that at the end. Remind me at the end, and we'll talk all about it. I have plenty to tell you all about it. All right, so looking at changes in metabolism in response to varying breakfasts. I didn't know if I had. Yeah, okay. So now we're going to look at how your body reacts to taking in these different kind of carbs on the inside. Not as like a performance level, but what happens to your metabolism when you start taking these carbs. Yo, Dylan, how you doing, man? So these guys were given a breakfast that included a bunch of carbs, some protein, and a very small amount of fat, and then they ran for 30 minutes on a treadmill. So they were given either a high glycemic, really simple sugar, or low glycemic, a little more complex sugar meals beforehand. We're doing solid, Dylan. Talking about carbs to make yourself stronger and better. All right, and so how does this affect their metabolism? So we're looking at a couple of different things here. We're looking at plasma glucose, and when I say plasma, I mean basically in your blood. So blood glucose, blood insulin, and then blood glucagon, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So this one makes sense right here. This chart makes a lot of sense. So we have the dark ones are the high glycemic and the light ones are low glycemic. So we can see that the high glycemic index carbs made their glucose go up higher and then actually drop down low, right? Just like we saw in the beginning. And then the low glycemic index carbs, they didn't go up as far, they didn't go down as far, and they stayed pretty steady. So that's exactly what we saw before. And it's really cool to see it here in a laboratory application. No worries, Meatloaf. And we look at insulin, right? And so I don't know if you guys have an understanding about what insulin is or does, but the very simple answer to what insulin does is it allows your body to use glucose that's in your blood. And so when your blood glucose goes up, your insulin goes up. Now this is an issue that diabetics deal with a lot of time because their insulin basically doesn't work, and there's a couple reasons about that we can talk about on a different day. But in a normal, not quite, in a normal person, in a normal, happy, healthy person, higher blood glucose leads to a higher insulin spike. And so this is exactly reflective of what we would expect. A high glycemic index carb leads to a higher jump in insulin versus a low glycemic index carb here. So that all makes sense. And then glucagon is basically the opposite of insulin. These two hormones kind of work in tandem with each other. When one goes up, the other goes down. And so again, we're seeing exactly what we would expect. We're seeing high glucagon with the low glycemic and low glucagon with the high glycemic, which is the exact opposite of insulin here, which is good. So this study basically confirms what we were talking about in the very beginning. With high glycemic index carbs becomes high blood glucose and high insulin, which is super interesting. Oh, bummer, Dylan. All right, so what else do we see? So this is some other really interesting stuff. So we're looking not at sugar variables now. Now we're looking at fat variables. So plasma-free fatty acids, so how much free fatty acids are in your blood, and plasma glycerol. And glycerol and fatty acids are the building blocks of the fat in your body. I'm sure you guys have heard of triglycerides. So these free fatty acids and glycerol are what appear in your body when your body starts breaking down fat. And so this chart, again, makes a ton of sense with the idea that we're not giving the body access to as much glucose. So with a low glycemic index carb, you can see that as time moves on, you get a nice big spike in free fatty acids. And again, with glycerol, you have higher glycerol and then a big spike in glycerol with the low glycemic index carbs. Okay, but what does that mean? What is this telling us? What are we supposed to do with this information? So the really cool part about this is if I'm, for all intents and purposes, I'm kind of starving my body for excess glucose. My body wants to use glucose for energy, and it gets that from what I eat. But if I have a low glycemic index meal, I'm not giving it as much glucose as it wants. And so where does it get the energy that it needs to exercise or function or what have you? Well, it gets it from the main energy source that it has stored. It gets it from fat. And so this is kind of a cool indication of if I have a low glycemic index meal and then I go on to exercise, you can see that my body prefers to use fat during this exercise versus carbohydrates because that's what it has access to. So if you are looking to lose a little bit of weight, this is a really cool, kind of fun, interesting study because it shows you that I can have a pre-exercise meal of high glycemic index carbs and then still go on to exercise, and you can see that a bunch of fat is being burned and mobilized. So that's really, really cool. That's this fun little deal here you can see just from a simple study of taking blood glucose, or I should say blood markers. Let's see, and then, here we're looking at which substrates are being used for exercise. The white is carbs and the black is fat. And so here there's like an invisible line right here. This is before the exercise and this is during the exercise. So we have our high glycemic index bar here before exercise and here during exercise. And this tells us that if I have a low or a high glycemic index meal, before exercise, nothing really changes, right? A little bit, there's a little bit more fat in the low glycemic. But then during exercise, if I've given my body full access to all the glucose that it needs, then that's all it's gonna use, right? My body prefers to use glucose over fat. But if I give it a low glycemic index meal, then I'm not giving it what it needs, and it has to use a little bit of fat during exercise, which is super cool. And then finally we have our muscle glycogen, and you can see here that this makes sense with everything we've talked about so far. Muscle glycogen is higher both pre and post, or pre-meal, pre-exercise, and post-exercise. It's higher at every marker for the people who were given a high glycemic index meal. Paranoid Punky, go for it, man. Let's see. So I just want to, while we're waiting for Paranoid, does this all make sense to everyone? I know we're using a lot of big words and looking at a lot of really kind of awful graphs. I just want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about so far. So before a workout, it's best to eat low glycemic if you're trying to lose weight and fat. Yes, if you want to eat before you work out and you are trying to lose weight, if the goal is to burn fat and you feel like you should be eating beforehand, then low glycemic is good. Oh, you make it sound like I'm talking down to you. Perfect, perfect. But if you're looking to, you know, lift the most weight or run the farthest or the fastest, then a high glycemic meal will make a bigger difference. So it kind of depends on what the goal is. All right, so now we're going to talk about something a little bit different. This is what's called an intra-workout meal. So people are they're doing a 2-hour steady state at 60% of their max, so 60% of their maximum output, followed by a 16-kilometer TT, which is short for time trial. During their time, they consumed either 63 grams of isomaltulose, which is low glycemic, or maltodextrin fructose. And I know we had talked about fructose being low glycemic, but the maltodextrin is for sure high glycemic. And we talked about maltodextrin a few weeks back when we were talking about G Fuel and how it actually is really sugarific. So then we looked at performance, we looked at rate of perceived exertion, gastrointestinal discomfort, and I can't remember what NEFA means, but we'll get there. It's super sneaky because they say sugar-free because maltodextrin doesn't count as a sugar, but it does count as a glycemic index. It's really frustrating. All right, so here's what we learned. Remember we talked about how glucose makes your blood sugar go up and then back down, whereas low glycemic index carbs just go kind of very level, right? And so this is a really cool look at, maybe these guys started a little bit lower with the low glycemic index, but look at how they felt. Oh, sorry, I'm interpreting this incorrectly. So these guys were given either a bunch of sugar during the exercise or a very low glycemic index sugar. What this means, rate of perceived exertion, is how hard you think you are working. So if I'm working at 60%, but my rate of perceived exertion is high, maybe I feel like I'm working at 80%. I feel like I'm working harder than I actually am. And so here we can see the guys that took isomaltulose, the low glycemic index carb, felt like they were having a more challenging time. They were having a tougher time doing what they were doing because they weren't giving their body access to the glucose that it wanted. So this is going to come back to Paranoid Punky. You talked about having a low GI meal to help lose weight. So this is the other side of that coin, right? So yeah, it'll help you mobilize the fat in your body, but you're basically making it do what it doesn't like to do. It doesn't like to use the fat in your body. It likes to use glucose, and so it makes it so that it feels a whole lot harder. So this is an important factor here. You are using the energy that you want to be using. You're using that fat energy, but your body doesn't like it, so it feels like it's a lot harder. We also saw people who took the isomaltulose, the low glycemic index carbs, they didn't feel as great about it either. Your body, there are times where your body just straight out rejects it. It's crazy. So be aware of that. Make sure that you're, cognizant of the fact that your body wants to use sugar and it wants to use whatever's simple. But keep in mind that you're not going to automatically get cramps and bloated when you take low glycemic index carbs. These guys were working really, really hard, and they were really pushed to the limit. And so if you're just doing steady state exercise, I wouldn't expect this to be an issue. But the takeaway from here is that yes, you will be burning fat, but it'll be more challenging. So keep that in mind. All right, so I think we're getting closer to the end here. So another study looking at cyclists. We've been looking at cyclists like every one of these times, and that's because these guys love getting tested on. Scientists have lots of access to cyclists. So again, they did a 2-hour steady state. Again, they did a 100% max out to failure, and then they did. They were given different meals before they did their riding. What was the left column in the graphs? Do you mean this over here? Hey, Lemur, how you doing, man? So this is what's called the rate of perceived exertion. So how hard they think they were working. So the higher the number is, the harder they think they were working, even though they were all working the exact same. So they were all working at 60%, but the people who were taking low glycemic index carbs felt like they were working harder, which means they're having a harder time. These are what are called gastrointestinal variables. So how thirsty they were, how bloated they were, how cramped up they were, and how nauseous they were. And we saw some pretty significant differences during the workout. So they reported these after they were done. They filled out a questionnaire, and you can see that these were the answers. They had, weak or moderate or strong or very strong. And so these were how they reacted to the different types of carbs during the workout. All right, so we have riders again. They are put through a very challenging workout again. They are given a test meal to be consumed 30 minutes before riding. It is either high glycemic, as we have discussed, or low glycemic. Here are the numbers actually. The high glycemic is 69.3 glycemic index, and the low is 36, so big difference. All right, so why did I put this in here? We already saw all this, but this is a big, beautiful representation of the glucose and the sugar response of the riders as they exercised. Or so they took the meal here at minus 30 minutes. They exercised at 0 minutes, and then the exercise lasted for 2 hours. So we're looking at their blood variables as they exercise. So again, low glycemic, we see big bumps, and then we see big drops, and then they come back and they go down, right? This all makes sense. And it's the same with glucose. High glycemic has big glucose spike, big insulin spike, big insulin drop, and then nothing after that. And then low glycemic has a little insulin spike, little insulin drop, and then it moves forward. Little glucose spike, glucose drop, and then moves forward. So these all make sense. I'm actually not sure why I put this one here, because this one makes a ton of sense. Let's see, what are we looking at? All right, so again, we're looking at what's called the respiratory exchange ratio, the rate of perceived exertion, and the time to exertion. All right, so let's walk through these one at a time. The time to exertion is a very important variable, because what it's saying is, if we go back to the protocol here, they did a 2-hour steady state ride, and then they sprinted as long as they possibly could, 100% VO2 to failure. That means they got on their bike and they rode as hard as they could for as long as they could. It's a very difficult, challenging test, but it says a lot about what they have energy resource-wise. So if we move forward over here, we look at the low glycemic index guys, and they were actually able to ride their bikes almost a minute longer than either the control or the high glycemic index guys. So that means that guys who consumed the low glycemic index carbs before their workout were able to maintain their sprinting significantly longer than the guys who either took no meal or the guys who took a high glycemic index meal before their exercise. So this is a really great, no worries, Keith. This is a really great argument for endurance when it comes to high glycemic index carbs, right? So they all did the 2-hour ride, and then at the end, the low glycemic index group had a ton of extra energy at the end to use. We're looking at rate of perceived exertion here, and this lines up perfectly with our last study. The guys that took the, oh wait, no, this one's opposite. How interesting. So the rate of perceived exertion, it's probably because this is a steady state exercise, but it seems that the low glycemic index guys had a much easier time. You can see that their rate of perceived exertion is significantly lower than everyone else's. So see how their line's here, and it's a big drop from this line here. So if we're doing endurance exercise, we can see that it is much better to be using low glycemic index carbs. And then respiratory exchange ratio is a very, very fancy way to ask, where your energy is coming from. This is a pretty complicated way to measure it. It measures the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen that you exhale as you're exercising, and it's able to tell what you're using as a substrate. And so with a higher respiratory exchange ratio, it means you're using more sugar for your energy, and a lower scale means that you're using more fat for energy. And so you can see throughout here that people who were using high glycemic index carbs were using more sugar for energy, and that lines up perfectly with what we talked about before. Yeah, so this would have been a situation where they had one of those tubes in their mouths and they were breathing into the tube. Super uncomfortable, but there you go. All right. I think, there we go. All right, so conclusions. What does this tell us? So, high glycemic index carbs have their worth. If you're looking to exercise hard today and hard this afternoon and hard tomorrow, and you want to be at the top of your game for every one of those things, a high glycemic index meal is extremely important for recovering between exercise bouts. If you're going to get your muscles back to peak performance quickly between exercise bouts, there's nothing better than high glycemic index carbs. If we're going to be doing steady state exercise, we're going to be doing long drawn out races or like a marathon or a long bike ride, maybe a low glycemic index carb is a little bit better because it allows your body to use its energy a little bit more wisely, right? It doesn't give all the sugar in the beginning and then it all goes away. It gives it to you nice and slowly, and it's easy, and by the end you still have a little bit of energy left over. Let's see. And then when it comes to dose and timing, we don't need to worry too much about dose and timing, but I just think it's important that you guys know the difference between what a high glycemic is and what a low glycemic glycemic index is. Tactical, how you doing, man? But anyway, does anyone have any questions about that? I know that some of the graphs were a little fancy and a little bit hard to read, but I feel like at its core, this idea is very simple, right? Your high simple sugars, your high glycemic sugars, and it makes it this big boost, but then you kind of fall off, versus a low boost, but it carries for a lot longer. What's the question, Paranoid? So anyway, I think that's probably about the end of it. I have the references here if anyone's interested in reading the actual studies. There's actually more references here than we talked about today because I took a lot of them out, some that weren't really relevant to what we were talking about. This was mostly about glucose, but what's the difference between good carbs and bad carbs? Is it purely GI? So the reason I talked mostly about glucose is because glucose is what your body uses specifically for energy. So say you eat a bunch of fructose or you eat a bunch of sucrose, your body first turns it into glucose and then uses it. Because glucose is what you store in your muscles as glycogen. So it's really the most important thing to measure. When we're talking about good carbs versus bad carbs, yes, generally they're talking indirectly about the glycemic index. So a good carb is one that, perfect. The good carb is one that will not make your insulin spike as high. It will not make your blood glucose spike as high. It is a low glycemic index carb. So brown rice is a good carb. Sweet potatoes are a good carb. Things like that. But when you come to white bagels and spaghetti and Slurpees, it is those are what I would call bad carbs because they're just straight sugar. They give you this big spike in glucose and insulin, and they don't do as much for you. So that's what those are. Yeah, there you go. All right, so that's it for carbs. Just wanted to lay that all out there before I move on to Soaring Galaxy here. So anyway, that's all we have to talk about carbs. So thank you guys.